This exhibition is all out of reclaimed materials. It's items that I had accumulated over the years through salvaging old barns and mills and factories that were all built mostly in the 20th century. And I used most of the materials to build a house entirely out of reclaimed materials. And I aligned it to seasonal sun angles so that in the winter it's in full sun and in the summer it's in full shade, and oriented it into the prevailing winds in certain times of the year, and put a lot of planning into that, and followed the design philosophies for sustainable home design within the passive solar design philosophy, which essentially is a non-technological means of heating and cooling your house by aligning it to what already is, the sun and nature and creation as it exists, instead of trying to overcome the way nature has set things up with technology and solutions through, HVAC and even solar and wind. Those are all kind of technological solutions to live the way that we choose to live within an environment that's already been created for us to live within. So, I've done a lot of talks to engineers and architects along those whole lines, but in trying to communicate those ideas to people, I want them to the awareness to increase, and I thought I need to communicate with some visual medium that cuts out all the talking, because people tend to kind of glaze over after so much of the talking about math and aligning it to the sun and how you calculate those angles, and the tradition of people in the past who use those same methods to calculate sun angles. And so I used a lot of those materials left over from the home that I thought had a really nice patina or an interesting grain, and would put them aside and thought, I'm going to do something with those. And I also, I spend a lot of time doing advertising and commercial artwork for people, so I was really involved for the last 15 years in the advertising world. So I had a real awareness of what was going on within advertising, and I collected old vintage metal signs and accumulated those. I kind of have a real collector's bug. So eventually, I kind of came to see all of those old advertising messages, not so cute or quaint or kitschy from, this bygone era and how, nostalgic and cute they were. They began to seem to be more of a call toward consumerism and kind of objectifying women and using them to sell a product that they were wanting to sell. Like one of the signs in this exhibition was a knee-high cola sign, and it had a bottle of knee-high, which was at knee height to a woman's leg, sticking out, and it was from the 1930s. It said, "Take a good look," but then in small it said, "At the bottom." So, that was cute, right? Until some things happened in my personal life that made me look at those in a very different way, that is actually a very negative message to be sending. And a lot of the problems that we're living with now, at the end of the 20th century, are manifest through this consumer culture that was driven through all these ad messages. And when you start to kind of break down how those messages were constructed, they used the concept of this, visual language that was a series of symbols, even the letter symbols themselves, to put them together in such a sequence as to cause the viewer to have the desired thought come into their head. So that whole concept is kind of magical in and of itself, especially when you analyze, the word spell, or to cast a spell. Its root is in spelling. So when you take letters, line them up in a chain, and we have a cultural understanding of what those letters mean, that you have spelled out your intention to the viewer, and you have also cast a spell so that they will have the thought that you want them to have. And that's the whole function of the advertising world. And I thought if I could take that, deconstruct that whole message for consumerism, because a lot of these carry slogans of, drink, eat, enjoy, and those are all calls to take more than what we need. And the unsustainable culture that we're in now is, a result of that convincing advertising magic spell that was cast for the last 100 years. So by deconstructing those, that was the first step, to kind of destroy that effort. But then the second phase of it would have been to reconstruct it, and the choices that I made with reconstructing it, I based it off of patterns that are the elemental building blocks of natural creation, and not like reinforcing this man-made creation that the advertising had initially been promoting. They were promoting a man-made creation where, you know, and distracting us away from what we had been given within nature. And it's really kind of, even for me, speaks all the way back to the whole kind of Garden of Eden story where, you know, you were given this garden by the Creator, everything that you need. And that garden still exists around us, but we have been distracted away from that and conned into thinking that the advertising world and the man-made world provides us with what we need. So by using the elemental building blocks of the natural world as patterning within the reconstruction of what the advertising was trying to message us with, that was, for me, kind of a means of recasting the spell to redirect people's thoughts towards the natural world. And I did it through using this concept of self-similarity, which all natural creation is based on this idea of self-similarity, that the smallest unit of creation is identical to the largest unit of creation. So, especially through triangulation, the smallest equilateral triangles within these come together to form the larger ones, come together to form pentagons, come together to form octagons, and that lattice is what all natural creation is based off of. Buckminster Fuller utilized that same geometry in his geodesic dome, which, by the nature of doing that, it is the most sustainable means of enclosing a volume. And he created that same system of triangles, and they become larger and larger units. Like the most well-known example of a geodesic dome is Epcot Center. So, the smallest unit of that is the triangle, and they just come together to form this enormous ball, and that can just keep going and going. So, in the case of these, you have the small unit here, 4 of them creates the larger one, and so on and on down. So that was kind of a nod back to that idea of self-similarity, that exists in the natural world as a means to kind of redirect people in that direction. I worked as a design consultant to preserve Buckminster Fuller's original dome home in Carbondale, Illinois. He was a professor there and he lived in it. So for the promotional efforts to raise money to preserve that dome, I had to redraw the dome. And in doing so, I noticed that there was this pattern that kind of emerged out of one linear axis of it that looked very much like a tree of life diagram from the Kabbalah or mystic Judaism, which is inherited to them it's an older system from Egypt. And it's very interesting because that is a means of understanding creation for them, and it's also kind of a thought intention tool. So for the purposes of this show, it seemed like a natural progression to configure some of the work within that tree of life diagram, which contains 10 different points in it that help understand how the Creator manifests this world. And it's also a prayer tool or a thought intention tool for you to help, when you have a hope or a wish or a desire for something to become, that you use that as a tool to help do that. And that's what the advertising was doing in a negative way. And that's again where the magic kind of comes in. This idea, that's a clinically, magical thinking is a illness. That if you think that your thoughts and ideas can have some sort of effect on material reality, then you suffer from magical thinking. But science, as we explore further and further, into quantum and string theory and some of these far out new theories, they're beginning to say, well, yeah, there's this observer effect, and when we do observe the subatomic particles, they seem to behave differently than when we're not observing them. So there is a connection between intention and observation and the material world. And ancient people understood this intuitively, or however they understood it. We're beginning to use the tools of science to kind of validate that and remember that, you know, wisdom that they had had initially. And back at the same time when this tree of life diagram was concocted, and the whole concept of language and letters, a symbol standing in the place of something actual, you know, that was an innovation at one point. And they felt like, wow, I can show you this string of symbols, and if you have a cultural context for them, then you will have the desired thought that I hope you have. Advertising obviously ran amok with that, and you know, the rest is kind of history. This is that vertical axis of the Bucky dome. And on the tree of life diagram, there's 10 different points. And when I laid the tree of life diagram over this axis of the geodesic dome, it lined up perfectly. Within the geodesic dome and within the tree of life, there's a hexagon nested inside of another hexagon, nested inside of a pentagon, and then culminating down in an equilateral triangle. And each of these lines would, on the geodesic dome, represent the connective structure of it, and then on the tree of life, they're also the connective structure between the 10 different sephirot they refer to them as. Now, this obviously isn't a dome, but if you were to copy this one, rotate it 72 degrees, rotate it 72 degrees, they go all the way around, connecting in the central pentagon, and then they are able to then curve and form that iconic dome structure. But, you know, the fact that his home was literally built out of 5 tree of life diagrams is either a bizarre coincidence or he did it intentionally. And the only evidence that I would have kind of circumstantially that he kind of did it intentionally would be that in his biography, he cited his Aunt Margaret Fuller as the biggest influence in his life. Margaret Fuller was the matriarch of the Transcendental Movement. She was the influencer of Emerson, Thoreau, Marie Cassatt, all of those folks. And she's not as well known, but if you were to Google her, it would come up that she is accepted as the first feminist. But her idea of feminism, I think, you know, she was interested in all human rights. She was interested in the rights of indigenous people and slaves. She was an abolitionist. She, you know, that was during the time of Manifest Destiny and the whole westward expansion. And I mean, here in St. Louis, obviously, that was the embarking point for that. The Gateway Arch, you know, that was the gateway to the west for that whole kind of exploitation of our natural resources, our indigenous population. It was on the backs of minorities, you know, and women were misrepresented. She was living in that time and almost as if she was someone from the 21st century and seeing it for what it was and calling it out. Well, that was Buckminster Fuller's aunt, and that was, like I said, kind of the matriarch of that Transcendental Movement. And if you follow her impact, you see, like, you have a guy like Gandhi citing Thoreau's civil disobedience doctrine, and then you have a guy like Martin Luther King citing Gandhi's role in India. So her impact, although kind of below the level, you know, really revolutionized our whole global culture, I think, on some level. And it's because she understood these ancient modes of thinking. She was a huge fan of mythology. And she, you know, when we think of mythology, part of adding that into the title of the show, we think of myth as a lie now, like Mythbusters. You know, a myth is a falsehood. Well, myth isn't necessarily actually a falsehood. We just think that these ancient, ignorant people didn't have science, so they couldn't understand the world around them, and they had to make up these kooky stories to explain it to each other. That couldn't be further from the truth. They understood it better than we do at this time because we weren't distracted by all the technology and all the man-made world. They lived and dwelled within natural creation. They observed its patterns. And the word geometry itself, you know, derived from BC time period, and it was geo as in earth, and then meter as in measure. So the original idea of geometry was the measuring of the earth, or the measuring of natural creation and the observing of natural creation. And through doing that, people like Pythagoras were able to, extrapolate all of this geometry that made sense of this seemingly random